There is a scene near the end of season 7 where Rigby is standing on a stage, about to graduate high school on live television, and Mordecai is standing off to the side of that stage with an expression on his face that the show does not ask you to look at very closely, because if you look at it closely, it stops being funny. It is not pride. It is not relief. It is a small, tight, embarrassed flicker of resentment, the specific expression of a person who has just realized that someone he has spent years being condescending toward is about to accomplish something he has not. Rigby, the character built from episode 1 to be the impulsive screw-up, the one who never finishes anything, the one who eats his own body into a coma over free snacks, is about to walk across a stage and become, for one afternoon, the better man. And Mordecai's face does the thing faces do when a person is trying to arrange itself into support and can't quite finish the job before jealousy gets there first. Tonight is about that face. Tonight is about the 10-year case, built one small, unglamorous scene at a time, that Mordecai, the Blue Jay, who has top billing on every poster and every intro sequence, the character whose name comes first in the title cards, the one the show's own promotional material treats as the lead, was never actually the hero of regular show. Not the funniest, not the most important, not even by the end, the one who grew the most. I am Velvo, and I want to walk you through this slowly, the way you'd walk through a house you thought you knew, only to find a door in the back you never opened, a room nobody mentioned, a set of stairs that goes down further than the house should technically allow. That is what tonight is. Not a takedown, not a hit piece on a cartoon Blue Jay who never did anything to deserve one. Just a long, patient look at where the actual weight of this story was sitting the entire time, and how far that turns out to be from where the poster art told you to look. Get comfortable. We've got a long night ahead of us. Let's start with the obvious complaint, because it is the doorway into everything else, and because you cannot understand why Mordecai isn't the hero of this show until you understand what hero was ever supposed to mean inside it. On the surface, regular show is built around a duo. Mordecai, a Blue Jay in his 20s, and Rigby, a raccoon in his 20s, work as groundskeepers at a public park, and for 8 seasons the show frames them as a matched pair, co-leads, co-slackers, co-protagonists of every plot. That is the premise you get from a synopsis. It is also, if you actually sit and watch the run in order, not quite what happens. What happens instead is that the show spends its first several seasons treating Mordecai as the responsible half, the one who occasionally says something like, "Dude, we should probably do our job," while treating Rigby as the chaos agent who ignores him. And because Mordecai is positioned as the reasonable one, the show quietly grants him a kind of moral hang ground he does very little over time to actually earn. He gets to be the audience's entry point, the one whose eye rolls at Rigby's antics mirror our own. But being the person who rolls his eyes at someone else's mess is not the same as being the hero of the story. It's closer to being the narrator who happens to also be a character. And once you start pulling on that thread, You start noticing how much of what the show frames as Mordecai's virtue is actually just Mordecai being slightly less reckless than the single most reckless character in the cast, which is a very low bar, and clearing a low bar does not make you a hero. It just makes you the taller of two short men. If you're watching this right now, tell me where you are and what time it is for you. I always like knowing where these videos end up landing. What city, what country, what hour of the night you've got the lights down for this. Drop it in the comments. Now let's keep going, because the low bar is only the beginning of the problem. Here is the thing about billing. Mordecai's name comes first in every promotional description of this show you will ever read. He is drawn first in most of the poster art. He gets the first line of dialogue in the pilot. All of that is a kind of narrative promise, a promise that says, pay attention to this one. This is the character the story is organized around. And for a long time, the show caches that promise the easy way by making Mordecai the audience surrogate. He is the one who reacts to things the way we would react to them. He is embarrassed when Rigby is embarrassing. He is tired when Rigby is exhausting. He wants, in a general and low-effort way, to be a good employee, a good friend, a good boyfriend, and the show lets that wanting stand in for actual heroism for years, because wanting to be good and being good look identical in the kind of 11-minute episode structure regular show ran on for its first several seasons. There usually wasn't room for the gap between intention and action to matter. The park would be destroyed, a video game villain would show up, a monster would need punching, and by the time the credits rolled, nobody had time to notice whether Mordecai's growth was real or just implied by proximity to a happy ending. But then something happened that a lot of shows never let happen to their nominal lead. The show kept running long enough and got serious enough about its supporting cast that you could actually watch the gap widen in real time. You could watch Rigby, introduced as the worse of the two friends by every metric the show offers you, worse at his job, worse at relationships, worse at basic follow-through, slowly and unglamorously become someone who finishes things. And you could watch Mordecai, introduced as the sensible half, spend that same stretch of years mostly still being the character who reacts to other people's growth rather than generating any of his own. This is not speculation. This is structural. It is baked into the actual episode list, verifiable the way you'd verify any other sequence of events, and it is the first real crack in the idea that Mordecai was ever the one carrying the emotional weight of this show on his shoulders. Look at what the show actually does with Rigby across its run. He begins as a character whose defining trait, according to nearly every guide to the show's cast, is that he is impulsive, selfish, and insecure, the one who consistently makes terrible decisions that put everyone else at risk, and who spends the early seasons living in Mordecai's shadow by design. That's not a fan reading. That's the plain shape of the character as written. He is the one who breaks the thermostat in the meat locker because he can't stop himself from continuing to eat free snacks even after being warned. An episode called Rigby's Body, where his own body, quite literally, gives up on him and walks away, leaving his disembodied consciousness to argue with a similarly abandoned soul who belongs to a different kind of excess. It's worth noting that the show doesn't let this pattern stay a one off gag either. Years later, in an unrelated episode called It's Time, Rigby is shown deliberately ordering a salad instead of his usual junk food, a small, wordless detail that only makes sense if you remember what happened to him the first time his diet caught up with his body, which tells you the writers were tracking his growth carefully enough to plant a quiet callback rather than simply forgetting the joke once its episode ended. That is the level of self-control the show establishes for him at the start. He is the character who, in another early episode, learns a karate move and immediately weaponizes it to become a bully around the park, because the show wants you to understand, early and clearly, that this is someone who has never once been trusted with anything resembling power and does not know what to do with it when he briefly gets some. And then, patiently, over years, the show starts building him a different future. The turning point most people who have written carefully about the show point to is his relationship with Eileen, a character who, and we'll come back to her, is one of the only people in this entire cast who says exactly what she feels, exactly when she feels it, without performance or delay. Her belief in Rigby, sustained over years, in which he does not deserve it yet, becomes the quiet engine of his transformation. It's not one big speech. It's not one cathartic episode. It's a slow accumulation, an episode called The Eileen Plan, where he learns that as a teenager, she'd hoped to end up with someone accomplished, someone who finished what he started, and instead of shrugging it off the way the old Rigby would have, he goes quiet, and something in him decides to try. That decision becomes a season-long arc that runs across multiple episodes, and it culminates in Rigby's Graduation Day special, the actual Season 7 finale, where he finishes the high school diploma he dropped out of as a teenager, live on a television broadcast, in front of Eileen, in front of the whole park, in front of Mordecai. And here's where it gets uncomfortable for the thesis that Mordecai is the hero of this show, because the episode does not let Mordecai simply be happy for his best friend. It shows you, directly and without flinching, that Mordecai feels a flash of resentment. The show's own internal logic, confirmed by people who've broken this episode down beat for beat, is explicit about it. Mordecai has always privately enjoyed being the one who's doing better than Rigby, the more together one, the one whose life at least looks like it's moving forward, even when it isn't, and watching Rigby actually accomplish something real threatens that quiet, unearned sense of superiority. It's such a small, human, ugly little moment. It is also one of the most honest things the show ever does with its supposed lead, because it refuses to let him be simply good. It lets him be petty in the exact moment where pettiness costs the most, his best friend's biggest day, and it makes you sit with the fact that the reasonable one, the responsible one, the one whose name comes first in the credits, has spent years quietly needing Rigby to stay behind him in order to feel okay about himself. Rigby, notably, doesn't need Mordecai's validation to finish what he starts anymore by this point. He needs Eileen's. And by the time the series ends, the flash-forward sequence that shows you what happens to everyone confirms that this wasn't a fluke. Rigby ends up married to Eileen, with children, holding down a life outside the park entirely, having completed the exact kind of stable, grown up existence that the early seasons treated as something he was constitutionally incapable of. The show's writers, when they've spoken about it, have framed his arc as the character going from the show's biggest screw up to arguably its most inspiring example of growth. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's the stated intention behind the writing, and it lines up with everything visible on screen. Compare that to what actually happens to Mordecai over the same stretch of time, and the comparison does not flatter him. His arc, for most of the show's run, is romantic rather than personal. Years of circling Margaret, the red-feathered robin who works at the coffee shop, followed by years of an on-again, off-again relationship with CJ, a cloud being with a temper as changeable as her weather, and the show frames almost the entirety of his emotional development through the lens of these two relationships, rather than through anything he does independently. He doesn't go back to finish something he abandoned. He doesn't take on responsibility nobody is forcing him to take on. He waits. He hesitates. He agonizes over decisions long after the moment for making them cleanly has passed, and when he finally does act, it is very often in exactly the wrong direction, at exactly the wrong time, in front of exactly the wrong audience. Take the specific, verifiable shape of his romantic timeline, because it is instructive in exactly how indecisive this character actually is. Underneath the sensible label, the show hands him for free in its first season. In an early episode called Yes, Dude, Yes, Mordecai mistakenly believes Margaret has gotten engaged to someone else, and rather than simply asking her, rather than doing anything that requires directness, he spirals into what the show plays as a genuine low point and starts trying to find a replacement girlfriend as fast as possible, which is how he meets CJ in the first place, not through any organic connection, but as an emotional rebound built on a piece of information he never bothered to confirm. That single, unverified assumption ends up shaping years of the show's plot. When he eventually discovers Margaret was never engaged at all, he does not handle it with any particular grace. He invites both women to the same event, creating exactly the kind of collision his own avoidance had guaranteed. And when he and Margaret finally do kiss, in the episode Stake Me Amadeus, his reaction is not joy or relief or even simple embarrassment. It's panic, because he'd eaten something with bad breath beforehand, and so, being a character who has access to a literal time machine through his best friend, he uses it to travel backward and stop the kiss from happening at all, undoing his own long-awaited romantic breakthrough over something almost comically shallow. That is not the decision-making pattern of a hero. That is the decision-making pattern of someone who, even when the universe hands him exactly what he's been quietly wanting for years, cannot tolerate the vulnerability of actually having it. Even the way that relationship gets restarted tells you something about the pattern. CJ and Mordecai's romance is reignited almost by accident in an episode called Dodge This, where the two of them run into each other again during a dodgeball match and are forced, mid-game, to actually acknowledge the fling they'd already had and quietly let drop rather than resolve. That's the recurring shape of nearly every major beat in this relationship. Not a decision Mordecai makes on purpose in a clear headed moment, but a collision he gets shoved into by circumstance, which he then has to react to rather than direct. It's a small detail, but it's consistent with everything else this relationship does to him right up through its ending. The CJ relationship, when it eventually curdles in a way that puts Mordecai's character on trial in front of the entire supporting cast, and the show does not let him off easy for it. In Dumped at the Altar, an episode set during Muscle Man's wedding, a day that belongs, by every rule of basic social conduct, to somebody else entirely. Mordecai chooses that exact afternoon to try to end things with CJ, interrupting the ceremony to work through his own unresolved feelings in front of everyone. Muscle Man calls him out for it directly, mid-wedding. Starla calls him out for it too, mostly because they'd like to actually get the reception started. Rigby, of all people, chides him for the timing, which tells you everything about how badly Mordecai has misjudged the moment, because Rigby is not typically the character standing in as the voice of social good sense. What makes this scene sting the way it does, if you go looking for how it's actually cataloged by people who track this show's tropes carefully, is that the episode is explicitly built around a moment the show's own internal shorthand identifies as a what the hell hero beat, the exact narrative device where a story stops and asks its supposed protagonist, in effect, what is wrong with you, out loud, through the mouths of the people around him. Shows reserve that device for characters who have just done something that violates the basic decency the story has been asking you to assume they possess. It is not a device you get to use on a genuine hero. It's a device you use on someone the narrative is quietly confessing has let you down. None of this means Mordecai is a villain, and the show never once frames him that way. And I want to be careful about that distinction, because there's a difference between arguing someone isn't the hero of their own story and arguing they're some kind of secret monster. He isn't. He's something much more ordinary, and in a way, much harder to watch. He's a person in his 20s who is decent enough and lucky enough and likable enough that the people around him keep forgiving the pattern instead of naming it. Margaret forgives it. CJ eventually stops trying to forgive it and simply leaves, which the show treats, and this part is worth sitting with as one of the more mature developments among the show's central relationships, precisely because it removes Mordecai's ability to keep circling indefinitely. Rigby forgives it, mostly, because Rigby has his own list of things that need forgiving, and the friendship runs both directions. But forgiveness from the people around a character is not the same thing as heroism inside the story those people are living through. It is, if anything, evidence that heroism was never really being asked of him in the first place, that his function in this show was never to be the one who saves anyone, but to be the mirror the audience holds up to their own hesitation, their own bad timing, their own tendency to wait until the moment for clean action has already closed. Where does that leave the actual title of hero, if it isn't sitting where the poster art tells you it's sitting? The show, when you look closely enough, offers you at least 4 serious candidates before Mordecai even enters the conversation, and each of them earns the word in a completely different way, through sacrifice, through quiet endurance, through emotional honesty, through cosmic weight. Let's take them one at a time, starting with the one who has been doing the actual heavy lifting since before Mordecai and Rigby were even born. Skips is introduced to you in the show's earliest episodes as a kind of background utility character, the Yeti groundskeeper who fixes whatever's broken and offers advice nobody quite understands the depth of yet. He moves through the world by skipping instead of walking, which the show plays for a long time as a small running joke and nothing more. But the show eventually gives Skips a full-length origin episode, a half-hour installment, longer and more dramatically weighted than the standard format, that departs from comedy almost entirely, and what it reveals recontextualizes every appearance he's made up to that point. His real name isn't Skips, it's Walks. He was an ordinary teenager once, prone to getting expelled from schools for fighting, who fell in love with a young woman named Mona while attending a school connected to an ancient order called the Guardians of Eternal Youth. Through that connection, he became entangled with a cosmic bully named Clorgbane, a creature who returns to threaten the world every 157 years, and who, in a battle meant to protect the people Walks cared about, ends up indirectly responsible for Mona's death, crushed by falling debris in a fight that was never actually hers to be in. Grief-stricken, Walks accepts an offer of immortality from the Guardians specifically so that he can keep fighting Clorgbane every time the creature returns, because someone has to, and he no longer has anything left to lose that the passage of centuries can take from him. When asked to choose a new name to mark the transformation, he thinks of the last happy memory he has of Mona, the two of them literally skipping together around their school grounds, and chooses Skips in her memory. From that day forward, he never walks again. Every single footstep the show shows you Skips taking for the entire run of the series is technically an act of mourning. It's a small gesture disguised as a visual gag, and once you know what it actually is, you cannot unsee it. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is stated, on-screen, verified canon, confirmed by the show's own wiki, and repeated across every serious breakdown of the episode that exists. And once you sit with it, you start to understand what kind of hero Skips actually is, as opposed to the kind the marketing wants you to assume Mordecai is. Skips doesn't want credit. He doesn't seek out the fights he ends up in. He has been doing this, quietly, for roughly 200 years by the time the show's present-day events take place, defending a world that has no idea what it owes him, taking on cosmic threats. The two younger groundskeepers barely register as real until they're standing in front of them, when the park itself is threatened in the two-part season 4-episode Exit 9B, an installment widely regarded by critics and fans alike as one of the show's best, where the entire staff is brainwashed, their memories erased, and the park itself demolished to make way for a highway. It is Skips who has the connections, the history, and the standing to summon allies capable of turning the tide, figures like Death, the ancient basketball deity, the guardians of eternal youth themselves. Mordecai gives a speech in that episode, and it's a good speech and it matters. But the actual firepower that saves the day, The actual network of 2 centuries of relationships and sacrifice that makes victory possible at all belongs to Skips. Mordecai supplies the morale. Skips supplies the infrastructure. Those are not the same job, and only one of them requires having spent 200 years quietly carrying a grief nobody around you even knows to ask about. If Skips is the hero the show has been quietly running since episode 1 and never announcing, Pops is the hero the show has been hiding in plain sight, and then finally, in its final stretch, refuses to hide any longer. For most of the series, Pops functions as something close to comic relief, a sweet, slightly senile older man with a lollipop-shaped head, the adoptive son of the wealthy and severe Mr. Maillard, who owns the park. He does very little actual work. He is confused by ordinary things. He seems, for years, to exist purely to be gentle in a show otherwise full of yelling. And then, in the final season, the show reveals what he actually is, and it recontextualizes every gentle, confused, harmless moment that came before it. Pops was born Megacranus, described by the show's own canon as the perfect creation of his home planet, an embodiment of pure good, and his birth automatically created an opposite, a twin brother named Malum Cranus, known to Mordecai and Rigby as Anti-Pops, who exists specifically to balance him out as an embodiment of destructive evil. The two of them are fated to fight over and over across cosmic cycles that stretch back further than recorded time, and every single previous encounter between them has ended the same way. A stalemate, a punch thrown by each, and the destruction and rebirth of the entire universe. Pops has spent his whole life on Earth, hidden by his adoptive father, kept gentle and unaware specifically so that he would not have to become the version of himself the universe eventually needs him to become. And when the fight finally comes, in the 2-part series finale titled, deliberately, as a bookend to the very first episode of the show, a regular epic final battle, Pops does something none of his prior incarnations ever managed. He refuses to simply punch his brother back. Knowing that another exchange of blows will simply destroy the universe and create a new one, exactly as it always has, Pops instead pulls Anti-Pops into an embrace and flies with him directly into the sun, giving up his own life in an act that is not combat, but something closer to forgiveness, something closer to love, aimed at the one person who has spent existence trying to erase him. And in his final moments, Anti-Pops, feeling something that might genuinely be his brother's care for him for the first time in the whole of their cosmic rivalry, softens. He stops fighting, the two of them die together, peacefully, and for the first time in the entire history of their conflict, the universe is not destroyed in the process. Pops's death is the thing that finally, permanently ends the cycle. Let that sit for a second, because it is worth sitting with. The creator of the show, J.G. Quintel, has spoken directly about why he wanted Pops to die, rather than survive, describing the sacrifice as a way of symbolizing the sadness and loss that comes with the kind of maturity the rest of the characters have, by that point, finally reached. This isn't an accident of plotting. It's a deliberate authorial choice to give the show's gentlest, least dangerous seeming character, the single most consequential act of heroism in its entire run. Bigger than anything Mordecai does, bigger than anything Rigby does, bigger, honestly, than almost anything any cartoon comedy of that era asked its audience to sit with. Pops doesn't win by being strong. He wins by refusing to be anything other than what he already was: kind, patient, and willing to die, rather than let the cruelty on the other side of his own bloodline have the last word. That is what the actual word hero is supposed to describe when you use it seriously. It is not a synonym for the character whose face is on the poster. It is a description of someone who gives up everything they have for the sake of everyone else without asking for the applause first. Mordecai gets a statue built in the park for him at the end of the show. It's not built for Mordecai, it's built for Pops, and everyone left standing knows exactly why. Then there's Benson, who almost never gets discussed in these terms, and probably deserves to be, because his form of heroism is the least glamorous kind there is. The heroism of simply staying, year after year, in a job that grinds you down, because somebody has to keep the operation running while everyone around you gets to have adventures. Benson is the gumball machine-headed manager of the park, and the show spends the majority of its run playing his fury for laughs. He yells, constantly, at Mordecai and Rigby over disasters that are almost always at least partly their fault, and the show's writers have joked openly about how physically taxing the character became to voice, with Sam Marin reportedly losing his voice and developing a migraine after recording one particularly intense outburst for the episode Think Positive. That episode is worth pulling out specifically because it's one of the rare moments the show lets you see what the anger is actually costing him. Pops, of all people, the gentlest character in the cast, threatens to fire Benson unless he stops yelling at the two groundskeepers, and Benson tries, genuinely tries, to hold it in and stay positive, and the effort of suppressing that anger nearly destroys him and the park around him before Pops realizes the mistake and tells him it's all right to let it out. The lesson embedded in that episode, if you take it seriously rather than just laughing at the outburst, is that Benson's anger isn't a character flaw the show is asking you to condemn. It's a pressure valve for a man who is the only person on staff without a cosmic safety net, without an immortality, without a godly bloodline, without a shortcut of any kind. Just a manager trying to keep two aimless 20-somethings from getting the whole operation shut down over and over for years because he genuinely has nowhere else to be and nothing else he'd rather be doing than keeping this specific, strange little park alive. And then there's Eileen, whose form of heroism is the quietest of all and maybe the hardest for a show full of avoidance and bad timing to actually earn the right to include. She starts as a minor character, a mole who works at the coffee shop with Margaret, defined mostly by an unrequited crush on Rigby that the early seasons play strictly for laughs. But across the show's run, she becomes one of its most fully drawn characters, precisely because she does the one thing almost nobody else in this cast reliably does. She says what she means when she means it, without waiting for the safer moment that never actually arrives. She tells Rigby she likes him long before he is ready to hear it. She tells him when he's hurt her. She tells him when she's happy, plainly, without performance. Set her honesty next to Mordecai's years of miscommunication, his mistaken assumptions, his time machine assisted retreat from his own first kiss, his ill-timed public confrontation with CJ at somebody else's wedding, and you start to see the show quietly building an entire argument about what actual emotional maturity looks like versus what merely appears responsible on the surface. Eileen is never the one whose face is on the poster. She's the one whose example the show's real growth stories, Rigby's most clearly, end up modeling themselves after. So if you tally it up honestly, the show gives you at least 4 characters who do the specific, hard, costly things that the word hero is actually supposed to describe. Skips defends the world for 2 centuries in grieving silence and never once asks for recognition. Pops gives his literal existence to end a cosmic war forever, choosing forgiveness over combat in the one moment forgiveness has never once worked before. Benson holds a chaotic, dangerous, constantly imperiled workplace, together with nothing but stubbornness and a temper he's ashamed of, because somebody has to and nobody else will. Eileen tells the truth, consistently, in a cast full of people who'd rather avoid it, and her honesty becomes the thing that finally teaches the show's most stagnant character how to grow. Mordecai, set against any one of those 4, does not come out looking like the hero of the story. He comes out looking like something much more familiar and much less mythic. The guy standing near the hero, reacting to what's happening, sometimes helping, sometimes getting in the way of his own happiness, mostly just trying to get through his 20s without figuring out anything faster than he absolutely has to. I want to go back to the finale itself for a moment, because it's easy to say Pops is the real hero and move on, but the finale actually goes out of its way to give Mordecai something to do, and looking closely at what that something is tells you a lot about what role the show was always actually casting him in. In the 2-part episode that closes out the series, the crew travels to Pops's home planet, Lollyland, and learns the full history of the cycle they're caught in, that in every previous confrontation between Pops and anti-Pops has ended the same way, in a stalemate that resets the universe, and that the previous incarnations of the park crew fought alongside Pops each time without ever changing the outcome. Knowing this, it's Mordecai who comes up with the idea of setting traps for anti-Pops, an attempt to give Pops a tactical advantage he's never had in any of the prior cycles. That's a real contribution. It is not nothing. But notice the shape of it. Mordecai's role in the climax of the entire series is logistical. He is the one who helps set the stage. He is not the one who walks into the fire. When the actual moment of sacrifice arrives, it is Pops who makes the choice that ends the war, and it's a choice that has nothing to do with any trap Mordecai devised. It's an emotional decision born out of 2 brothers' entire shared history, and it happens on a plane that Mordecai's contribution never touches. The show even gives you a beautifully strange, self-aware visual cue in this same episode as reality itself starts coming apart. Rigby becomes a crude test animation post-it note, and Mordecai is shown reduced to a rough storyboard panel, both of them literally sketched down to the bones of what they are, rough drafts of characters still being worked out, while Pops is the one experiencing the actual, finished, weighted climax of the story. Even the show's own visual language, in its final minutes, seems to know which of these characters is a fully realized hero and which of them is still, on some level, a draft. What happens after the sacrifice tells you the rest of what you need to know about where the show's own moral center actually sits. The park crew returns home, and the show gives you a flash forward across the following years, a device the series had used before in time travel episodes and now uses one final time to tell you, plainly, what everyone's future actually looks like. A statue of Pops goes up in the middle of the park, not because anyone insists on it, but because it's simply, obviously, understood by everyone left standing that he is the one who saved them all. Mordecai's own future, when you finally get to see it, turns out to be about as ordinary as it's possible to be for a character who's just survived an intergalactic war. He becomes a working artist, which the show has been quietly setting up all along through his recurring habit of doodling and painting in idle moments, and he marries a Batwoman named Steph, someone entirely new, someone who has nothing to do with either of the two great unresolved relationships that consumed most of his screen time for 8 years. It is, by the writer's own account, a deliberate choice. They've said outright that they felt the Margaret and CJ stories had reached their natural conclusions, that both women deserved to be shown moving on with lives of their own rather than orbiting Mordecai indefinitely, and that giving him someone new was their way of finally letting his personal arc close on its own terms, rather than resolving into whichever X he happened to end up choosing. There is something almost generous in that choice, and I don't want to undersell it, because it is one of the more mature decisions this show makes, refusing to reward 8 seasons of indecision with a tidy romantic payoff, and instead suggesting, gently, that the person you spend your 20s agonizing over is very often not the person you actually end up building a life with. That's a real insight, and it's one the show earns honestly. But notice what it also quietly confirms. Mordecai's entire arc across the series was never actually about growing into someone capable of decisive, self-generated action. It was about waiting long enough for his own bad timing to finally exhaust itself so that life could hand him an ending regardless of what he did or didn't figure out along the way. Rigby had to build his ending. He had to go back to school, sit through classes he was embarrassed to need, give a speech in front of a live television audience about admitting you didn't finish what you should have finished years ago. Pops had to choose his ending, consciously, in the single hardest moment of his existence, trading his life for the possibility that love might succeed where combat never had. Mordecai's ending simply arrives, the way most of his big moments across the show arrive, a little late, slightly by accident, and mostly a matter of things finally working out, despite him rather than because of him. This is, I think, the deepest and least comfortable layer of the whole argument, and it's worth being honest that from here on, we're moving from documented fact into interpretation, a reading the show invites without ever quite stating outright. It's this: Mordecai's actual narrative function in regular show was never to be its hero, it was to be its mirror. He is the character built specifically to reflect an audience of 20-somethings back at themselves, their own hesitations, their own bad excuses, their own tendency to let a good decision arrive 5 years later than it should have, their own quiet, unexamined resentment when a friend gets somewhere they haven't managed to get yet. You are not supposed to watch Mordecai and think, that's the guy I want to be. You are supposed to watch him, and if you are honest with yourself, in the particular unguarded state, this show seems designed to catch you in, late at night, half drifting, headphones on, recognize something closer to your own reflection than to an aspiration. The show doesn't need Mordecai to be extraordinary, because his entire dramatic purpose depends on him staying ordinary long enough for the extraordinary things happening around him. A 200-year-old grief still humming quietly under every skip of Skips's feet, a literal God choosing gentleness over the only kind of power he was ever technically entitled to use, a middle manager holding a fraying operation together purely through stubbornness, a mole who simply always tells the truth to have somewhere ordinary to land. There's a version of this reading that goes even further, and I want to flag clearly that this next part is speculation, the kind of pattern noticing that fans have built up around the show, rather than anything confirmed by its creators. But it's worth mentioning because once you see it, it's hard not to notice it again. The show's voice cast doubles up in a very specific, lopsided way. Sam Marin voices Benson, Pops, and Muscle Man, three of the show's most emotionally significant characters, spanning fury, gentleness, and wounded performance, as though one actor's voice is being asked to carry three separate registers of the show's actual heart. J.G. Quintel, the show's creator, voices Mordecai himself, alongside High Five Ghost. There's a way of reading that division, again, purely as interpretation, nothing the writers have ever confirmed as intentional, where the character built by the person actually running the show gets to be the ordinary one, the reactive one, the one who mostly watches, while the heaviest emotional lifting of the cast gets distributed across the actor, voicing the characters most explicitly built for sacrifice, anger, and performance. It's a small detail. It might mean nothing at all. But it's the kind of detail that, once you notice it, makes the whole architecture of who gets to be the hero here look a little less accidental than a casual first watch would suggest. It's worth pausing on how this reading fits with how the show's own audience has actually received the character over the years, because the doubts about Mordecai's heroism aren't something invented for this video. They've been circulating in less organized form across fan communities for a long time. One recurring criticism, raised often enough that it's become a fixture of how people discuss the character, is that Mordecai doesn't undergo genuine character development in the way the show seems to want you to believe he does. That he tends to only change or learn something when he's forced to by external circumstance, often when his own life is directly at risk, rather than growing organically, the way Rigby eventually does. That's not a verified fact the way Pops's death, or skips his backstory are verified facts. It's audience reception, a documented pattern of criticism rather than confirmed authorial intent. And I want to be clear about that distinction. But it's a criticism that holds up reasonably well against the actual episode list, because so many of Mordecai's supposed turning points really do arrive at the point of maximum external pressure rather than from anything resembling quiet, internal reflection. He doesn't decide on some ordinary afternoon that he wants to be braver about his feelings. He gets shoved toward bravery by a deadline, a crisis, a wedding he's chosen the worst possible day to disrupt. There's also a specific critique that's followed the character for years concerning how he treats Rigby, and it's worth sitting with honestly rather than rushing past it, because it complicates the easy version of these two are best friends, and that friendship is the real story. Some of the show's harshest audience critiques point to moments where Mordecai's frustration with Rigby crosses out of the show's usual comic register into something closer to genuine cruelty. Moments where, under stress, he says the kind of thing to Rigby that friends aren't supposed to say to each other even in anger, or takes advantage of Rigby's slower reflexes and comparative physical weakness in ways the show plays for laughs, but that land, if you slow down and actually watch the body language, a little uglier than a laugh track wants you to notice. None of this makes Mordecai a bad person in some absolute sense, and the show never frames him that way, and the friendship clearly survives all of it, and clearly does contain real, mutual affection. You can see that affection plainly in the small, quiet moments. The two of them slumped on a couch together, the two of them defending each other against outside threats without a second's hesitation. But a hero, in the load-bearing sense the word is supposed to carry, isn't just someone who loves his friends. It's someone whose love holds up consistently under pressure without the flashes of pettiness and self-interest that keep showing up in Mordecai whenever the stakes get personal rather than cosmic. Rigby's flaws are loud and obvious, and always have been. Everyone around him has spent years telling him so, out loud, to his face. Mordecai's flaws are quieter, and because they wear the costume of being the responsible one, they go unchallenged for years longer than they probably should. I want to be fair to him here, because there is one place where Mordecai's growth is genuinely, unambiguously real, and it would be dishonest to build a case against his heroism without acknowledging it. His handling of Margaret's departure, the storyline where she chooses to leave the park behind entirely and pursue journalism school, following her own ambitions rather than staying tethered to Mordecai's emotional orbit, is one of the more mature things this show ever asks its lead character to do, and he mostly does it well. He doesn't chase her unfairly. He doesn't sabotage her decision or guilt her into staying or spend the following seasons sulking in a way that punishes her for having a life of her own. He lets her go, and the show phrases that letting go as real growth, a quiet act of respect both for Margaret as her own fully realized character and, implicitly, for the audience watching a young male learn that romantic disappointment doesn't have to curdle into resentment. It's a genuinely good moment for him, and it deserves to be named as one, sitting right alongside all the moments that don't reflect nearly as well on him. Growth, even uneven growth, even growth that arrives mostly through external pressure and bad timing, corrected too late, is still growth. I don't think the case here is that Mordecai never grows. It's that his growth, set against Rigby's, against Hopops's, against Skips's centuries of quiet defense, against Benson's daily grinding endurance, against Eileen's plain and constant honesty, simply doesn't rise to the level the word hero is supposed to describe. He's not a villain in this story. He's not even really a disappointment most of the time. He's just an ordinary young man in an extraordinary show, and the extraordinary parts of the show mostly happen around him rather than through him. There's a broader thematic current running underneath it all of this that's worth naming plainly, because it helps explain why the show was willing to let its nominal lead be this unglamorous. Across its whole run, regular show returns again and again to a quiet argument about what it actually costs young men, specifically, to learn how to feel things honestly instead of performing toughness or indecision instead. Muscle Man, the constantly performing tough guy who is neither muscular nor especially tough underneath the bravado, eventually learns to mourn his father openly rather than through the exhausting mythology he's built around the man's memory. High Five Ghost, defined for years by almost nothing except a running joke about unreturned high fives, eventually finds a quiet, stable relationship and a family without the show ever making a special episode out of the fact that he's doing all of this as a literal ghost. Rigby, as we've already gone through in detail, learns to finish what he starts because someone finally believed he could. Every one of these men, by the end of the series, has said something true to someone he loves at real emotional cost, and the show treats each of those moments with a weight and sincerity that its comic tone elsewhere would never lead you to expect. Mordecai's version of that same lesson is the slowest one in the cast to actually land, and maybe that's the point of him. Maybe the show needed exactly one character whose growth stayed incomplete and uneven and mostly externally triggered for the entire run, specifically so the audience would have somewhere honest to see themselves, not in the Yeti who's been quietly grieving for 2 centuries, not in the God who chooses to die for love, not in the manager holding a chaotic workplace together through sheer bloody-minded stubbornness, not in the one person in the cast who has always, unfailingly, told the truth, but in the guy standing near all of them, mostly meaning well, mostly getting there eventually, mostly a few years and a few bad decisions behind where he probably should be. That's not a flattering role. It's also, if you're honest with yourself about your own 20s, or your own 30s, or whichever stretch of your life felt the most like waiting around for clarity that never quite arrived on schedule, a deeply recognizable one. The show didn't put his name first because he was the hero. It put his name first because he was supposed to be the one you'd recognize. Let's follow that thread out into the space arc, because it's the part of the show where the stakes get largest and, correspondingly, where the gap between Mordecai's supposed importance and his actual function becomes hardest to miss. In the back half of the series, The park itself is torn away from Earth entirely and turned into a fugitive vessel hunted across the galaxy by increasingly cosmic threats, and the cast becomes something closer to a ragtag crew of reluctant space rebels than a group of park groundskeepers. New characters join them along the way. The tone shifts, noticeably, into something more serialized and more openly science fiction than anything the early seasons attempted. And through all of it, Mordecai remains essentially what he has always been: present, occasionally clever, generally along for the ride, contributing tactically here and there without ever becoming the character whose internal transformation is actually driving the plot forward. The show gives Rigby an entire arc running across multiple episodes about finishing his education in the middle of this chaos, and it gives Pops the entire weight of the cosmic mythology, and it gives Skips the connections and history that keep pulling old allies out of the woodwork whenever things get desperate enough to need them. Mordecai, notably, doesn't get an equivalent arc of his own during this stretch. He gets to keep being the reasonably competent, reasonably likable guy in the room, while everyone else's story reaches its actual crescendo around him. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it's easy to assume, watching any long-running show with a nominal lead, that the emotional center of gravity has to sit wherever the marketing puts it. Regular Show quietly refuses that assumption in its final stretch, and it does so with a confidence that a lot of shows of its era never risked. It lets its most consequential arc, the literal fate of the universe, belong entirely to a character who spent most of the series being mistaken for comic relief. It lets its most inspiring personal transformation belong to the character introduced as the worse of its two supposed leads. And it lets its title character, the one whose name people say first when they describe the show to a friend who's never seen it, spend the biggest, most dangerous chapter of the whole story mostly reacting, mostly helping at the margins, mostly just present. There's something almost radical in that choice, if you think about how rarely television is willing to let its billed lead simply not be the most important person in his own story. Most shows would have found some way to retrofit Mordecai into the cosmic mythology directly, given him a hidden power, a secret lineage, some reason the universe actually needed him specifically. Regular Show doesn't do that. It lets him stay exactly what he's always been, an ordinary guy, lucky enough to be standing near extraordinary people when the extraordinary things happen. There's a pattern the show leans on constantly that's worth pulling apart here, because it bears directly on how we should read Mordecai's place in all of this, and it's another place where I want to be upfront that we're moving into interpretation rather than confirmed fact. Regular Show is, structurally, a show obsessed with pairs. Mordecai and Rigby, Pops and Anti-Pops, Margaret and CJ, the two women Mordecai spends years failing to choose between. Skips and the version of himself he left behind the day Mona died, walks and skips being, in a sense, two names for the same grief carried across two different lifetimes. Even Benson gets a kind of paired counterpart in the brief, strange episode where he wears a sentient suit built to manage exactly the kind of slackers he's spent years yelling at, a costume that for a few episodes becomes almost a second self, giving him the confidence and respect he's spent the whole show quietly starving for, before it ultimately sacrifices itself so that Benson can go back to being simply, difficultly human. Read this way, and this is squarely interpretation rather than anything the writers have stated outright. The show seems to be making a repeated argument that no one becomes whole alone, that every meaningful transformation in this universe requires something or someone standing opposite you, whether that's a friend, a rival, a grief, or a war you were born into without ever being asked. Pops becomes whole in the most literal and devastating sense only by finally embracing the brother he'd spent his whole life running from. Rigby becomes whole only because Eileen refused to stop believing he could be. Mordecai's version of that pairing, for most of the show, is Rigby, and it is genuinely one of the show's better ideas that the two of them do eventually settle into separate, stable, grown lives, while somehow remaining exactly as inseparable in spirit as they were on day one. But even that pairing, in the end, serves Rigby's transformation more visibly than it serves Mordecai's. Rigby needed Mordecai's friendship the way anyone needs a witness, someone present for the whole embarrassing, unfinished middle of your life who's still there at the end of it. Mordecai, meanwhile, mostly needed time. Lots of it. More than the show, honestly, always seemed entirely comfortable giving him. Let's go back one more time to Anti-Pops, because the forgiveness angle at the center of the finale throws an unflattering light backward across everything Mordecai does with his own grudges and disappointments throughout the series, and the contrast is worth naming directly. Anti-Pops is not, in the show's own canonical framing, a separate villain unconnected to Pops. He is quite literally born from the same source, an equal and opposite cosmic force generated automatically the moment Pops came into existence, destined to fight him precisely because the universe apparently requires that kind of balance. And the way Pops finally ends that war isn't through strength or cleverness or even the traps Mordecai helps devise. It's through an act of radical, costly acceptance, an embrace offered to the one being who has spent the whole of existence trying to erase him, at the exact moment that offering it costs him everything he has left to give. Set that against Mordecai's handling of his own two central relationships across the run of the show. He doesn't reconcile with CJ. By the writer's own account, they never patch things up, and the breakup, while treated with more gentleness than cruelty, is very much presented as something Mordecai's own hesitation helped cause, rather than something that simply happened to him. He doesn't choose Margaret either, in the end, despite years of buildup toward exactly that outcome. His resolution with both of the women who shaped his emotional arc for most of a decade isn't forgiveness, isn't embrace, isn't any kind of active choice at all. It's more like exhaustion finally giving way to acceptance, the natural conclusion of enough time passing that the original question stops mattering as much as it once did. Pops ends his defining relationship by choosing, consciously and at maximum cost, to love the person hardest to love. Mordecai ends his defining relationships by simply running out of road to keep circling on. Those are not equivalent kinds of resolution, and only one of them deserves to be called heroic in any meaningful sense of the word. I keep coming back to Benson because I think he's the character this whole argument risks shortchanging if we move past him too quickly, and there's a version of this video that could have simply been about him instead of Mordecai. Consider what Benson actually has compared to everyone else on this list. Skips has immortality and 2 centuries of allies to call on. Pops has an entire cosmic order, however hidden, standing somewhere behind him, and ultimately has the power to end a war that has raged since before recorded history. Rigby has Eileen, patiently rebuilding his self-belief one unglamorous year at a time. Mordecai has good luck, decent instincts, and enough charm that people keep forgiving him past the point his behavior probably earns. Benson has none of that. Benson is, as far as the show ever tells you, just a gumball machine who wanted, once, to be taken seriously in a workplace that mostly treats seriousness as a punchline. He never wins Park Manager of the Year in an episode built specifically around watching him lose it and try to pretend the loss doesn't sting. He briefly finds something like the respect and command he's always wanted in the strange, sad little episode where he discovers a sentient exosuit in The Lost and Found, a suit built, quite literally, to help him manage slackers like Mordecai and Rigby, giving him for a few days the confidence he's never otherwise had access to. And even that borrowed confidence has to be sacrificed by the episode's end, because it turns out to be running from its own violent past, and Benson has to let it go, alone, the same way he lets go of almost everything across this show. He tries to quit the park more than once. He always comes back. Not because some cosmic force compels him to, the way it arguably does for Skips, but because, as far as anyone can tell, he simply doesn't have anywhere else that needs him the way this ridiculous, dangerous, constantly imploding job needs him. That's not the heroism of grand sacrifice. It's the heroism of showing up, furious and unrewarded, day after day, because the alternative is letting the whole operation fall apart around people who genuinely cannot run it without him. If you're looking for the character in this show whose day-to-day existence most resembles what most adults actually experience, the unglamorous grind of responsibility nobody applauds you for, it isn't Mordecai, it's Benson, and Benson never once gets a statue. There's a thought experiment worth running here, the kind of thing that only becomes visible once you've spent this long taking the show apart piece by piece. Imagine regular show with Mordecai simply removed from it, replaced by any reasonably competent Blue Jay with slightly less specific baggage. Does the finale change? Not really. Pops still has to choose between combat and forgiveness, and that choice belongs to him alone, regardless of who's standing nearby holding a trap plan. Does Skips's arc change? Not at all. His 2 centuries of quiet grief exist independently of whichever groundskeepers happen to be working there in any given decade, which the show tells you outright by implying, gently, that there have been other Mordecais and other Rigbys before the ones we know, cycling through the same job across the same span of centuries. Does Rigby's transformation change? If anything, it might happen faster, freed from a friendship dynamic that sometimes seems to have quietly needed him to stay a step behind. Does Benson's daily grind change? Not remotely. Now try the same experiment in reverse. Remove Skips from the show, and the 200-year network of alliances that saves the park in Exit 9B disappears with him, and nobody else in the cast has the standing to replace it. Remove Pops, and there is, quite simply, no finale, no cosmic war, no ending, no reason for any of the space arc mythology to exist at all. Remove Eileen, and Rigby, by every account the show and its writers have given of his arc, never becomes the man who walks across that graduation stage. Remove Benson, and the park closes within a season, because nobody else in this cast has ever once demonstrated the capacity to actually run anything. The show survives losing Mordecai. It does not survive losing any of the other four. That, more than any single scene or line of dialogue, might be the cleanest possible proof of where its real narrative weight was always sitting. None of this is really an attack on the character, and I don't want it to land as one, because there's something quietly valuable about a show willing to build its most visible role around someone this unremarkable. Think about what most animated comedies of that era actually did with their nominal male leads, made them scrappy underdogs who turn out, eventually, to be secretly capable of far more than anyone expected, heroes in waiting whose ordinary exteriors were always hiding some unusual reserve of courage or cleverness the story eventually needed from them. Regular show quietly refuses that formula for its own lead, and it refuses it for 8 full seasons, which is a much harder thing to sustain than a single clever subversion in a season finale. It lets Mordecai stay ordinary the entire time. It never gives him a secret destiny. It never reveals some hidden reserve of untapped heroism waiting to be unlocked by the right crisis. When the crisis finally comes, in the very last episodes of the show, it goes to Pops instead, and Mordecai's contribution is exactly what an ordinary, decent, moderately clever 20-something's contribution to a cosmic war would actually look like. A good idea about traps, a speech that helps morale, presence, and loyalty, and nothing more mythic than that. There's an honesty in that choice that I think the show deserves real credit for, even while making the argument that it undercuts, decisively, any claim that Mordecai was ever meant to be understood as this story's hero in the load-bearing sense of that word. Think, too, about what the show's own title is quietly telling you, and how directly it undercuts the mythology built up around its most visible character. It's called Regular Show. Not Cosmic Show, not Park Warriors, not The Adventures of Mordecai and Rigby. Regular. The word sits right there in the marquee, insisting, before a single frame has played, that whatever grand and strange things are about to happen, the show understands itself first and foremost as a chronicle of ordinary life, regular jobs, regular friendships, regular disappointments, regular 20-somethings failing to say the thing they mean until it's almost, but not quite, too late. Read that way, Mordecai isn't miscast as this show's central figure at all. He's exactly the right choice for a story that wants its title to mean something. He is the regular the show is actually about. Decent, occasionally selfish, mostly well intentioned, slower to grow than he probably should be, lucky enough to end up somewhere good anyway. The heroism, the sacrifice, the 2 centuries of grief carried in silence, the literal God choosing gentleness at the cost of his own life. All of that gets to exist inside this story precisely because it's happening around and alongside a genuinely regular guy, someone ordinary enough that the extraordinary things landing near him feel like they're landing near you too. That's not a flaw in the show's design. That might be the whole design. I think about the graduation scene again because it's the moment that first cracked this whole reading open for me, and it's worth returning to it once more before we start winding down tonight, because it's such a small, specific, human thing to notice in a show that spends its final stretch dealing in gods and cosmic wars. Mordecai standing near that stage, feeling that flash of resentment at his best friend's success, and then, because the show does eventually let him do the right thing, even if it takes him a beat longer than it should, walking over anyway, handing Rigby something to steady his nerves, admitting, quietly, that he's been unfair to him. That admission matters. It's real growth, even if it's small, even if it arrives a little late, even if it's dwarfed by everything else happening around it in the show's final season. But notice the shape of it one more time. Mordecai's biggest, clearest moment of personal honesty in the entire back half of the series is not about his own life. It's a reaction to somebody else's accomplishment. Even his best moment of growth is, structurally, a supporting response to somebody else's story. That's not nothing. It might even be, in its own small way, the most honestly heroic thing he does across the whole run, not saving the universe, not choosing forgiveness over combat, just managing, for once, to be generous instead of petty at the exact moment generosity is hardest to access. It's a human-sized kind of goodness, the kind most of us actually get to practice in our real lives, far more often than we get handed cosmic wars to end through acts of self-sacrifice. Maybe that's worth something too. Maybe that's the version of heroism this show was quietly leaving for the rest of us, the ones watching from the couch, the ones who were never going to be Skips or Pops either. There's a reason it takes years, sometimes a full rewatch as an adult, to notice any of this, and I think that reason is worth naming more plainly before we go any further, because it says something about how television trains us to watch in the first place. We are conditioned, almost from childhood, to assume the character whose name comes first, whose face anchors the poster, whose voice opens the pilot episode, is the character the story is fundamentally about. That assumption isn't laziness on the viewer's part. It's a reasonable inference, built from decades of storytelling convention that usually rewards it. Most shows do organize themselves around their build lead. Most protagonists really are the characters whose internal transformation the plot is engineered to track. So when you first watch regular show as a kid, or as a teenager half paying attention while doing something else, You carry that assumption in with you automatically, and the show doesn't go out of its way to correct it early on, because for a long time, in the loose, episodic first few seasons, it barely matters who the real hero is. Nobody's dying for anybody yet. Nobody's carrying 2 centuries of grief yet. It's just two guys avoiding work, and Mordecai's mild competence relative to Rigby's chaos is more than enough to sustain the illusion that he's the one holding the moral center. It's only in retrospect, watching the whole thing bake with the ending already in your head, that the earlier seasons start to look different, that Skip's quiet competence in episode after episode starts to look less like a running joke about a weird Yeti handyman and more like 2 centuries of muscle memory belonging to someone who has done this exact kind of rescue work more times than he could ever count. That Pops's harmless confusion starts to look less like comic relief and more like a carefully maintained disguise, one his own adoptive father has been helping him wear since infancy specifically, so he wouldn't have to become what he eventually has to become. That Benson's fury starts to look less like a bit and more like the sound of a man holding something together that keeps threatening to come apart in his hands. This is, I think, part of why the show has stayed so alive in the memory of the people who grew up with it, because it's one of those rare pieces of television that actually improves, structurally, on a second and third viewing, once you know where the weight was always secretly sitting. You go back to season 1 with the ending in your pocket, and Skip's skipping past the camera in the background of some throwaway scene suddenly means something it didn't mean the first time. You go back to Pops offering someone a lollipop and forgetting what he was about to say, and it reads now as a God choosing, deliberately or not, to stay small enough to be loved by ordinary people a little while longer before the universe comes calling. That's not a small trick for a show about slacker groundskeepers to pull off. That's the kind of thing you usually only get from stories that were building towards something specific the whole time, whether or not the writers knew, in the very first season, exactly how far they'd eventually take it. Consider, too, what happens to Muscle Man and High Five Ghost by the time the series reaches its final stretch, because their arcs quietly reinforce the same pattern we've been tracing all night. Every man in this cast, apparently, except Mordecai, gets his defining emotional breakthrough delivered with real, unflinching weight. Muscle Man spends most of the show performing a version of toughness built entirely around the memory of his father, a beloved local strongman the show eventually reveals to have been a far gentler and more thoughtful man than the legend Muscle Man has constructed around him. When his father dies, the show doesn't play it for laughs. It lets Muscle Man grieve openly in front of the people who love him, and it treats that grief as one of the more genuinely moving stretches in the entire series, a character built almost entirely out of bravado finally admitting there was never any bravado underneath it worth defending. High Five Ghost, meanwhile, spends years as the most thinly sketched member of the main cast, defined by little more than the running joke of an unreturned high five, and the show eventually gives him an entire episode devoted to reconnecting with an old love and later a full domestic life, a marriage, a small house, a family, treated with exactly the same unremarkable sincerity The show extends to everyone else's happy endings. Set those two arcs next to Mordecai's, and you start to notice something almost pointed about how evenly distributed real emotional catharsis is across this cast, and how consistently it manages to avoid landing in its fullest form on the one character whose face is on the poster. There's a version of the ending that makes this whole argument almost too easy, and it's worth stating outright rather than letting it sit implied. The show builds a physical monument inside its own fictional world to mark who it considers its actual hero, and it is not Mordecai. A statue of Pops goes up in the middle of the park after the events of the finale, and the show doesn't need to explain why to anyone watching, because by that point you already know. Nobody debates it. Nobody suggests a statue of Mordecai instead, or of the whole crew collectively, or of anyone else who helped along the way. The text of the show itself, in its own final minutes, settles the question the marketing spent 8 seasons quietly obscuring. Heroism, in the specific, weighted, load-bearing sense this word deserves, belonged to the gentleman with the lollipop-shaped head who chose an embrace over a punch at the one moment in cosmic history when an embrace had never once been tried. Everyone else in this story, Skips with his 2 centuries of silent vigilance, Benson with his daily grinding endurance, Rigby with his slow, unglamorous climb out of arrested development, Eileen with her unwavering honesty, gets to be heroic in their own smaller, quieter registers, each one earning the word through a different kind of cost. Mordecai gets to be the guy standing nearby, decent and lucky, and occasionally, finally, generous, watching the statue go up for someone else, the way most of us, if we're honest about our own lives, mostly end up watching the biggest, most consequential moments happen to the people around us rather than through us. And maybe that's not actually a sad thing to end this on. Maybe there's something almost comforting buried inside it if you let it sit the way you're supposed to let things sit at this hour, lying there in the dark with all of this playing quietly through your headphones. Most of us are not going to be the one who ends a cosmic war through an act of forgiveness nobody else in billions of years managed to attempt. Most of us are not going to spend 2 centuries in silent grief, defending a world that has no idea what it owes us. Most of us are, on our best days, something much closer to Mordecai, a little late to our own growth, occasionally petty in exactly the moments that cost the most, mostly well-intentioned, mostly getting there eventually, lucky enough that the people around us keep forgiving the gap between who we want to be and who we've actually managed to become so far. The show never punishes him for that. It just quietly, patiently, refuses to call it heroism and lets the actual heroes in his life do the harder, heavier, more costly work of holding the story together while he catches up. There is something almost tender in a show willing to let its most visible character simply be ordinary for 8 straight years and still find him worth watching, worth rooting for, worth building an entire finale around even without making him its center. Regular Show, it turns out, might be the most honest title an animated comedy has ever worn. It told you exactly what kind of story you were getting right there on the box the whole time. There's a piece of this that shows up even earlier than the finale in the feature length film released partway through the show's run, and it's such a precise, almost eerie preview of the exact pattern we've been tracing tonight that it's worth pulling out on its own. Regular show. The movie sends Mordecai and Rigby back through a time machine to fix a mistake they made in high school, one that has, in the film's future timeline, driven a permanent wedge between them and left each of them living out a version of adulthood defined by that broken friendship. Along the way, the story introduces a future version of Mordecai himself, older, more financially successful, and, crucially, utterly alone, having achieved exactly the kind of external stability the show usually treats as the marker of having grown up, while having sacrificed the one relationship that actually mattered along the way. This future Mordecai starts out spiteful toward his younger self, resentful of the choices that led to his own isolation. But after hearing Rigby's unfiltered, painfully honest assessment of what happened between them, something in him softens, and when the villain of the film, Mr. Ross, threatens to kill the younger Mordecai, it's this future version of the character who steps in and gives up his own life to protect him, confessing, in his final moments, that despite all his success and status, he had ended up with no friends and no family to actually share any of it with, and that he would have been far better off staying close to Rigby than chasing whatever version of achievement had cost him that friendship. Sit with the shape of that scene for a second, because it is, in miniature, almost the entire argument of this video, arriving years before the finale ever gets around to making it explicit. Even in a story specifically about Mordecai's own future, the character who has to die to teach the lesson isn't present-day Mordecai learning something on his own. It's a future, wiser version of himself, functioning almost exactly the way Pops eventually functions in the finale. An older, more knowing figure who has to give up his own existence so that a younger, less self-aware version of the story can be handed a better outcome without having had to earn the insight independently. Mordecai, even inside his own dedicated feature film, needed someone else, in this case, quite literally, a future copy of himself, to make the sacrifice that actually changes anything. He doesn't grow because he sits down one day and decides regret is worth avoiding. He grows because a version of him who already lived out the consequences comes back to physically absorb the danger and hand him the lesson pre-packaged at the cost of that other self's entire existence. It's a strange, almost recursive confirmation of everything the rest of the series does with him. Whatever growth Mordecai receives across nearly every major turning point this show ever gives him tends to arrive as something given to him by someone else's sacrifice rather than something he generates, unprompted, from within. It's worth noticing, too, how small-scale Mordecai's own characterization stays for most of the show, even in the little incidental details the writers use to round him out, because it reinforces just how deliberately unmythic this character is compared to almost everyone standing around him. The show's own internal documentation of his personal quirks, the kind of thing that gets revealed in a diary-style episode, rather than through any grand mythological reveal, amounts to things like his fondness for going without proper clothing beneath his usual look, his guilty love for objectively bad pop music, his habit of prioritizing a cup of coffee over whatever responsibility is actually waiting for him that morning, and an old, half-forgotten fear of microwaves rooted in some unspecified childhood incident the show never sort of bothers to fully explain, because it doesn't need to. It's a joke, not a wound. Compare the scale of that against what the show eventually reveals about Skips, or Pops, or even Rigby, whose comparatively minor issue with self-control around junk food escalates into a genuine, if comedic, brush with losing his own body entirely, a detail some corners of the fandom have pointed to as an unusually blunt visual metaphor for compulsive overeating dressed up as a monster of the week plot. Mordecai's flaws, set against that same scale, stay resolutely small, private, and low stakes. He's a little vain, a little musically embarrassing, a little too attached to his morning coffee. Nothing about him, on the level of pure characterization, was ever built to carry the weight of centuries-old grief or cosmic destiny. He was built, quite specifically it seems, to be recognizable rather than remarkable, and recognizable, however likable, has never once been the same thing as heroic. There's one more piece of Skips's story worth sitting with before we move toward closing this out, because it underlines just how permanent and how lonely his particular form of heroism actually is, in a way that makes Mordecai's occasional bursts of bravery look even smaller by comparison. The deal Skips struck with the Guardians of Eternal Youth after Mona's death isn't a one-time act of heroism he gets to complete and then rest from. It's a standing obligation, renewed every 157 years, for as long as Clorgbane keeps returning, which, as far as the show's own canon ever tells you, is indefinitely. That means Skips isn't a hero because of one dramatic origin story battle you get to watch in a single flashback-heavy episode. He is a hero on a recurring, scheduled basis, across a length of time that dwarfs the entire lifespan of every other character in this cast combined, and he does it without complaint, without seeking recognition, without ever once suggesting to Mordecai or Rigby that the casual jokes they make about his immortality land anywhere close to how heavy the actual weight of it must be to carry. When Rigby, in the same episode where Skips finally tells them the whole story, asks the almost unbelievably tone-deaf question of whether Skips even graduated high school, completely missing the emotional register of what he's just been told, Mordecai's response is to physically punch Rigby for the insensitivity, which is notably one of the more genuinely decent things Mordecai does in the entire series. Recognizing, correctly and immediately, that his friend has just badly misjudged the moment and stepping in to correct it. It's a small gesture. It's also proof that Mordecai is capable of exactly the kind of social and emotional attunement that would make him a much better man than his own romantic track record usually suggests when the stakes are someone else's grief rather than his own. And then there's Death, who occupies one of the stranger and more tender corners of this show's cosmology, and who deserves a mention here because of what his presence tells you about how normalized real, permanent stakes have become inside this particular fictional park. Death appears across the series as a recurring figure, a leather-jacketed biker treated with a mixture of dread and easy familiarity by the entire cast, someone who has a wife, a son, rules he has to follow, and an oddly cordial, competitive rapport with Skips specifically, given that Skips's continued immortality makes Death's job measurably harder every single year. He shows up to collect people who have genuinely died, and he is, on more than one occasion, talked into letting them come back through some game or trick, which tells you something quietly remarkable about how negotiable mortality has become in this particular corner of the universe. High Five Ghost gets to exist as a fully integrated member of the cast, specifically because dying in this show doesn't function the way it functions anywhere else. And Death, notably, seems to like it there. He shows up to Muscle Man's wedding. He helps fight in the finale, alongside everyone else, against forces that could genuinely end reality. He is not treated, by this point in the series, as an antagonist at all, but as something closer to an old acquaintance who has simply been around long enough to have earned a strange kind of belonging. None of this is a story Mordecai has any real part in shaping. It's a piece of the show's larger architecture of quiet, permanent, mostly uncredited stewardship, the same architecture that includes Skips's 2 centuries of vigilance and Pops's entire hidden lineage, running steadily underneath the more visible plot of 2 groundskeepers avoiding their actual jobs, and Mordecai, for all his charm, never once becomes a meaningful part of that deeper structure. He remains, right up through the finale, a visitor to it rather than one of its load-bearing pillars. I want to Steelman the other side of this for a moment, because it would be too easy to end here without acknowledging the strongest version of the counter-argument, and a case built without acknowledging its own weak points isn't really a case worth trusting. There's a meaningful difference between a protagonist and a hero, and it's worth being precise about which word we're actually arguing over, because Mordecai unambiguously is the protagonist of regular show in the narrow, technical sense of that term. He is the character whose perspective the camera most often follows. He is the character present in the largest number of episodes, the one whose reactions frame most of the show's comedy, the one whose romantic entanglements structure entire seasons of plot. If you define hero simply as the character the story is told through, then sure, Mordecai wins that by a wide margin, and nothing I've said tonight changes that fact. But that's a thinner definition of heroism than the one the show itself seems to be reaching for in its most serious moments, and I think the show knows the difference too, which is exactly why it's willing to let its literal protagonist stand quietly to the side while somebody else gets the statue. A protagonist is a structural role. A hero, in the sense the finale actually earns the word, is a moral and emotional achievement, something you do at real cost, not simply something you are by virtue of getting the most screen time. Mordecai has the former in abundance. The latter, across 8 seasons, he mostly borrows from the people standing closest to him. There's also a fair objection that says, doesn't Mordecai contribute meaningfully to nearly every crisis this show ever throws at the park? And the honest answer is yes, often. He fights alongside everyone else against Auntie Pops's forces. He helps rescue the staff during the brainwashing crisis in Exit 9B. He devises the trap strategy that gives Pops a fighting chance nothing in billions of years of prior cycles ever had. None of this is nothing, and I don't want to pretend it is, because a case that overstates its own argument stops being persuasive the moment someone rewatches the show and notices you left out the parts that complicate it. Mordecai is a competent, loyal, generally brave participant in nearly every major conflict this show puts in front of him. He is not a coward. He is not useless. If anything, his consistent, unglamorous competence, showing up, fighting when it counts, never once actually abandoning his friends when things get dangerous, is itself a kind of decency worth naming, even if it doesn't rise to the specific, weighted thing the word hero is doing in a story that also contains a literal God's self-sacrifice. Competence and loyalty are real virtues. They're just not, on their own, the same thing as heroism, and this show, when it counts most, keeps drawing that exact distinction for you, episode after episode, right up until the moment it builds a statue to make the distinction permanent. What I think the show is actually doing, if you want the single clearest way to hold all of tonight's argument in your hands at once, is separating two things. A lot of stories collapse into one: who the story is about, and who the story believes deserves to be remembered for what they did. Those don't have to be the same person, and regular show, almost uniquely among the animated comedies of its era, seems to understand that distinction deeply enough to build an entire finale around honoring it. Mordecai gets to be the character the show is about, the lens, the entry point, the guy whose ordinary 20-something anxieties make the extraordinary things happening around him feel grounded and real instead of remote and mythic. But when the show has to decide, in its own internal logic, who actually deserves the statue, who actually did the hardest and costliest and most consequential thing anyone in this cast has ever done, it doesn't hesitate for a second, and it doesn't choose him. It chooses the gentleman who chose love over combat at the one moment in the whole history of the universe that choice had never once been tried. That's not an accident of plotting. That's the show quietly, patiently, telling you the truth about itself the entire time, if you were paying close enough attention to hear it. So let's let the park settle for tonight, the way we usually do around this hour. Somewhere in that house, on the edge of the property, two friends are asleep on top of their blankets, a television left on low, a video game paused on some frozen, glowing screen. Neither of them will remember pausing by morning. One of them will spend years circling two women he can't quite choose between, will use a time machine to undo his own first kiss out of nothing more serious than bad breath, will feel a flicker of something small and ugly at his best friend's biggest triumph before catching himself and doing, finally, the decent thing. The other will go back and finish what he never finished, will learn slowly and without any cosmic shortcut how to become someone worth believing in, because somebody patient enough loved him first. Somewhere up the hill, in a mansion that doesn't quite make sense to anyone who lives near it, an old man with a lollipop-shaped head is dozing in a chair by a warm lamp, carrying inside him a war he has spent his whole disguised life trying not to become, a war he will, eventually, end the only way it has never once been ended before, by refusing, all the way to the last possible second, to stop being gentle. Somewhere on a road at the edge of the park, an immortal man who has not walked, not once, in longer than most nations have existed, is skipping home from a long shift, carrying a locket. Nobody around him has ever asked to see. None of them are asking to be remembered as heroes. That's very likely the whole reason the word actually fits them, and the whole reason it never quite settles the same way on the one whose name we say first. If tonight helped you see this show a little differently, or if you've just been drifting somewhere warm and half asleep for the last little while, without all of this playing quietly in the dark, that's exactly what these videos are for. Stay a while longer if you want to. There's no rush to get up. And if you'd like more nights like this one, spent slowly walking back through a show that gave more of itself than it ever really had to, go ahead and subscribe and hit that like button on your way out. It genuinely does help keep the park's lights on for the next one of these. Sleep well. The staff will be there when you come back, whenever that ends up being. So will the statue. So, in whatever quiet way these things stay with you, will Mordecai, standing a little to the side of it, the way he mostly stood a little to the side of everything, decent enough, lucky enough, and ordinary enough that all these years later we're still, somehow, talking about him. Maybe that's the truest thing this whole video ends up saying, more than any single episode breakdown or any single comparison to Skips or Pops or Benson or Eileen. Maybe being ordinary, being the one who's late to his own growth, being the one who needs a friend's honesty or a stranger's forgiveness or a future version of himself to arrive and hand you the lesson you couldn't quite reach on your own, isn't actually the failure this whole argument has been circling around all night. Maybe it's just the shape most lives actually take, cosmic war or no cosmic war, statue or no statue. The show never punished Mordecai for being that. It just never called it heroism either. And maybe, if you've made it this far into the dark with me tonight, that's a distinction worth carrying with you long after the credits on this video have finished rolling. Somewhere, the park is still standing. Somewhere, the lights are still soft over the grass. And somewhere, quietly, a blue jay, who was never quite the hero of his own story, is still, all these years later, doing just fine anyway.